Ideally, you have people forming up opinions and desires and then voting for a government that represents them. But we know it works both ways. The government has enormous power to shape the opinions and desires of the population, and this power only increases today with the new technologies of surveillance, mass surveillance, and social media, and so forth. So when the government can, the government is not just responsive to the will of the people. It can shape the will of the people. And this really destabilizes the democratic system. Also, the media has an enormous role to play in this. That if the government has too much control over the media, then it's not like people are forming their own independent views about what's happening. We now have the power, or at least not we, but some governments and corporations for the first time in history have the power to basically hack human beings. There is a lot of talk about hacking computers, hacking smartphones, hacking bank accounts, but the big story of our era is the ability to hack human beings. And by this I mean that if you have enough data and you have enough computing power, you can understand people better than they understand themselves, and then you can manipulate them in ways which were previously impossible. And in such a situation, the old democratic system stopped functioning. We need to reinvent democracy for this new era in which humans are now hackable animals. The whole idea that humans have, they have this soul or spirit and they have free will and nobody knows what's happening inside me. So whatever I choose, whether in the election or whether in the supermarket, this is my free will, that's over. We need to come to terms with the fact that, no matter, again, this is where philosophy meets computer science and biology. No matter what you think ultimately is the truth of the universe, you have to realize that practically today we have the technology to hack human beings on a massive scale. And this means we need to reinvent democracy. We need to reinvent the market. Again, the whole idea of the customer is always right. We just do whatever the customers want. Yes, but you can now hack the customers. You can manipulate the customers to want what you tell them to want. So this whole idea that corporations just
beats you over the head for the rest of your life with a big national security stick. And so that people learn to duck their head and not speak up because bad idea now.
Well, that's a rather interesting position coming from a man on a crusade against the evils of technology.
I'm not against technology, Doctor. I'm against the men who deify it at the expense of human truth.
Armor of Truth, live.
In the age of technocracy, scientism, and pop atheism,
faith is resistance.
Nietzsche, of course, announced the death of God and called for the birth of the Übermensch, the Superman, who would take humanity to new heights and to create a new world order.
Find us at the Armor of Truth YouTube channel and log on armoroftruth.net.
Greetings, my friends. It's Armor of Truth Live number 202, where tonight we're opening up a study series on transhumanism for the church. We're glad that you're with us here. On the late evening broadcast, we're going to jump right in and start off by giving you a piece written by Francis Fukuyama. He is the professor of international political economy at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Author of some interesting books, and he has this to say about about transhumanism. There's a strange liberation movement that's grown within the developed world. Its crusaders aim much higher than civil rights. It aims much higher than the feminists or the gay rights advocates. They want nothing less than to liberate the human race from its biological constraints, right from its flesh. As the transhumanists see it, humans must wrest their biological destiny from evolution's blind process of random variation and adaptation and move up to the next stage as a species. Now, as we talk about this and we run through all the ideas that this group and movement have, it's tempting to dismiss the transhumanists as some sort of odd cult, just obsessed with science fiction. It's easy to not take them very seriously. They have over-the-top websites, press releases that say things like cyborg thinkers to address humanity's futures. But it's the fundamental tenet of transhumanism, the idea that we will someday use biotechnology to make ourselves stronger, smarter, less prone to violence, and live longer lives. Is that really so outlandish? Implicit in much of the research agenda of contemporary biomedicine, whether it's mood-altering drugs, substances to boost muscle mass, or selectively erasing memory, whether it's prenatal genetic screening, or gene therapy, perhaps a worldwide experiment in gene therapy. The intellectual or moral threat they represent is not always easy to identify. The human race, after all, is a pretty sorry mess, with our stubborn diseases, our physical limitations, and our short lives. I guess that's relative. Humanity's jealousies, our violence, our constant anxieties, and the transhumanist project begins to look reasonable if you don't have a consistent worldview. You might think, why wouldn't we want to transcend our current species? The seeming reasonableness is part of its danger. The seductiveness of its claims and promises are what make it so dangerous. And that's because this movement's goals, its designs, come at a frightful moral cost. For example, the first victim of transhumanism might just be equality itself. And we're talking in the sense of society, equality as society would see it. The most serious political fights in the history of the United States, just for one, have been over who qualifies as fully human. Women and blacks did not make the cut in 1776 when Thomas Jefferson penned the Declaration. Slowly and painfully, advanced societies have realized that simply being human entitles a person to political and legal equality. In effect, we have drawn a red line around the human being and said that it is sacrosanct. Underlying this idea of the equality of rights is the belief that we all possess a human essence. Something that dwarfs differences seen in skin color, beauty, and even intelligence. This essence and the view that individuals therefore have inherent value is at the heart of political liberalism. We're using that term in the classic sense, as in liberty, not in the sense that it's used in the United States here today, but in the classic sense. But modifying that essence is the core of the transhumanist project. If we start transforming ourselves into something superior, then what rights will these enhanced creatures claim? And what rights will they possess when compared to those left behind? So the implications for citizens of the world's poorest countries, for example, for whom these promises and new technologies will likely be out of reach, and the threat to the idea of equality becomes menacing. When you consider all of these factors, who will be able to afford these enhancements? Let's take that out of the future tense and put it into the present, because it's already here. We'll show you that later on in tonight's show. Transhumanism's advocates think they understand what constitutes a good human being, and they're happy to leave behind the limited, mortal, natural beings that they see around them in favor of something better. So we're seeing value judgments being made all over the place in the transhumanist movement. What standard do they use to decide who makes the cut? The question is, do the people pushing this movement, proselytizing for it, promoting it, do they really comprehend ultimate human goodness or evil? What standard do they use to draw the line between good and evil? The good characteristics are intimately connected to our bad ones, says Fukuyama. If we weren't violent and aggressive, we wouldn't be able to defend ourselves. If we didn't have feelings of exclusivity, we wouldn't be loyal to those close to us. If we never felt jealousy, we would also never feel love, according to Professor Fukuyama here. Even our morality plays a critical function in allowing our species as a whole to survive and adapt. Now, Professor Fukuyama is definitely coming from a worldview that affirms evolution, abiogenesis, that life came from non-life, that the earth is 4 billion years old, the universe 13 billion or whatever the number is this week. But he makes some good points here. As he says also, transhumanists are just about the last group I'd like to see live forever. He says we will never be able to anticipate the ultimate outcome. We don't know how this is going to turn out if they get their way. But we can already see the stirrings of the Promethean desires in how we prescribe drugs to alter the behavior and personalities of children. Dr. Fukuyama says we need a similar humility concerning our human nature. If we do not develop it soon, we may unwittingly invite the transhumanists to deface humanity with their genetic bulldozers and psychotropic shopping malls. So there's a lot to agree with there in Dr. Fukuyama's article which comes from Foreign Policy magazine. In 2004, he was writing about this. So let's look at a couple. Let's look at this right fast. There's the humanityplus.org. You see, this is the Humanity Plus. This is a frequently asked questions website that's been around for a while. It's been updated several times. Now it's in version 3.0. Hundreds of people have participated in this, and they give you some terminology and what's actually meant. Humanity Plus, also known as WTA, adopted this frequently asked questions website in 2001. Nick Bostrom, there's another name that's connected with the transhumanist movement. Ray Kurzweil is another. We'll talk about him later. Nick Bostrom added a substantial information about future scenarios with the contributions of close to 100 people. We've talked about Nick Bostrom here before when we did the simulation theory argument. We considered that and discussed why it was insufficient, fatally flawed, bankrupt. Why essentially the simulation theory was just a way for a man to deny God while describing how things exist when God's created them. Describing God's creation while leaving him out of it is essentially what the simulation theory does. But they give definitions here for us. What is transhumanism? It's a way of thinking about the future that is based on the premise that the human species in its current form does not represent the end of our development, but rather a comparatively early phase. So this is about evolution. We have to evolve ourselves. It's a philosophy. It's a class of philosophies of life that seek the continuation and acceleration of the evolution of intelligent life beyond its currently human form and limitations by means of science and technology guided by life-promoting principles and values, says Max Moore. Where do you get these values? Who decides? Who decides? 100 people decide? These 100 people probably can't agree on what they should have for lunch. When we talk about transhumanism, it leads us inevitably to the idea of post-humanism. Sorry about that. Possible future beings whose basic capacities so radically exceed those of present humanity as to be no longer unambiguously human by our current standards. The standard word for such beings is post-human. As they say here, care must be taken to avoid misinterpretation. Post-human does not denote just anything that happens to come after the human era, nor does it have anything to do with posthumous or after death. In particular, it does not imply that there are no humans anymore. It just means a new, possible future human that is not even recognizable if we could see them today. And there is also the Transhuman Manifesto, this website here, humanityplus.org as well, where they give the philosophy of transhumanism. And it, of course, as we said, it's very persuasive, especially if you don't have a consistent worldview. If you didn't even know you had a worldview, this might sound like a good idea to you. Originally crafted in 1998, the Transhumanist Declaration was by an international group of authors. some of the names we just mentioned. The Transhumanist Declaration has been modified over the years by several authors and organizations. It was adopted by the Humanity Plus board in March of 2009. Okay. So that leads us up to, that's our introduction. So I want to take off now on a little bit of a philosophical journey, and we're going to also talk a little bit about literature. And the reason for that is we want to, in this series of videos that we're going to bring you. Now, when I say series, I don't mean we're going to have show 1, 2, and 3, but over a period of time, we're going to cover this topic until we feel like we've exhausted it. And I can tell you right now, that's not going to be anytime soon. I'm sure many of you, if you're new to this channel, you're new to this kind of discussion, might not have ever heard the term transhumanism to begin with. After tonight's show, you're going to know what the term means, and you're going to know exactly why it's important. Not just important, but crucial. It's crucial that we understand what this movement is, what it means, what it stands for, where they want to take humanity, and the fact that many of these folks are positioned in, are in positions to cause this to happen. I'll show you how that is as we move on. But first of all, what we want to do is lay a foundation for how to think about this. How do they think about it? Where do these terms come from? And how do we understand what it is that we're actually talking about? So the phrase Brave New World, most famously the title of a science fiction novel by Aldous Huxley, published in 1932. It's a phrase taken from Shakespeare's play The Tempest. Now it's used ironically as the Brave New World presented as a utopia, when it turns out, in fact, to be a nightmare in which human beings are trapped in a society where their humanity is deleted. In The Tempest, Prospero, the rightful Duke of Milan, was banished by his usurping brother Antonio to a deserted island. There, Prospero lived and raised his daughter Miranda. As Shakespeare's The Tempest opens, Prospero uses his powers to stir up a storm that shipwrecks a number of dignitaries from Italy, including Antonio and Alonso, the King of Naples. As the play progresses, Miranda, the daughter of Prospero, who has never seen a man other than her father, meets Ferdinand, son of the King of Naples, and falls in love. So near the play's end, Prospero confronts his brother Antonio, along with the others who were shipwrecked in the Tempest. And so Miranda, upon seeing this whole entourage of people, exclaims joyously, "Oh, wonder, how many goodly creatures are there here? Oh, brave new world that has such people in it." Well, Miranda meant that seriously, but the mind behind Miranda's naive observation certainly intended her assessment to be ironic. Now, several hundred years later, Aldous Huxley entitled his vision of the future, Brave New World. Like Shakespeare, Huxley too meant those words ironically. Brave New World is Huxley's frightening vision of a world in which freedom is dead and all concepts of morality are forgotten. Life is manufactured and controlled from beginning to end by modern technology. Huxley published his book in 1932, and it's uncanny how similar our world is today to that which Huxley crafted for literary impact, perhaps. Perhaps he saw something. But John and Paul Feinberg, in their book Ethics for a Brave New World, right within our lifetime, developments in technology have brought staggering changes to the way people can be conceived, born, healed, or die, and the prospects for the future are as mind-boggling as what has already happened. Our duty as cultural apologists is to set forth what ought to be against the backdrop of what is, and to boldly proclaim Christ to a world enslaved by the fear of death. That's what we're up against right now. Evaluating the darkness of the world against the truth of Scripture enables us to determine the rightness or wrongness of what is and how we should live in light of it. So more than ever, there is contention even among Christians about how we should live in this changing world. In regard to the advancements of technology and new possibilities, controlling life and death, most of the developments in technology could not have been foreseen or addressed by the writers of Holy Scripture. Now, because of this, some may think it's impossible to address these topics from the Christian worldview or from a Christian perspective. We strongly disagree with that. Even though Scripture never addresses directly many of the issues we see before us today, it did set forth enough principles about life and death and a citizen's relation to government that it is possible to evaluate contemporary practices in light of biblical teaching. Moreover, it's not only possible to address these matters biblically, it is mandatory that we do so. In a pluralistic society, as we have, Christians can no longer assume that others, our children included, will be exposed to and adopt Judeo-Christian morals or will know how to apply them to concrete situations. Since, as Christians, we must speak to these topics lest we find out too late that a morality foreign to Scripture has not only won the day but has even been enacted as the law of the land. So let our judgments be determined by Scripture. That's our goal, and its application through reason and always in that order. When anyone exclaims Brave New World today, they're expressing a cynical attitude to something. For example, a controversial issue such as governments merging man and machine to create super soldiers, or new worldwide mass experiments in gene therapy under the guise of vaccination, may elicit the exclamation, "Oh, brave new world." It generally refers to an era, one characterized by feelings of hope because of some societal changes, but with the fear that it's not going to go well. It's not going to go the way it was thought it would. Another way of expressing the irony of the phrase is its reference to changes that are meant to improve people's lives, but which bring additional unforeseen problems. Could also mean simply a bleak and dismal future such as Huxley envisaged in his novel, a future which human beings, with all their innate creativity and individualistic instincts, are grown in laboratories, designed to fit into different types, which will perform different particular jobs in society with no chance of transcending their designs. So that takes us up to, we've heard the transhumanist definition of transhumanism. So we would like to go a little deeper on that and listen to what they actually have to say to us. Before we get there, let's make sure that we understand the worldview at play here. There are metaphysical assumptions being made constantly. If you research this, or as you listen to our work here, you're going to realize these people have some idea of what they think ought to be, what ought to be. And that is where value judgments come in. That is where, as cultural apologists, that's where our ears perk up and we get involved fast. So metaphysics, that's the branch of philosophy that examines the nature of reality. It's who we are. Who made us? Why are we here? Where are we going? What does it all mean? Is there something beyond this world? Everyone has these. Everyone has metaphysical assumptions. And so when we ask the question, according to what standard? What we mean is, unless you have a coherent, consistent worldview, and there's only one of those in existence, and that is the Christian worldview, It answers all of these questions. Unless that is your worldview, your decisions about what is good and what is evil, who we are, who made us, is going to be different from person to person. It's going to be a matter of opinion rather than objective truth. Generally, among people, there are two ways, two essential foundations that inform a person's worldview. Mimesis is the idea that the world has a given order and it has a given meaning, and that it's as beings, as human beings in the world, it's our duty to conform ourselves to the given design of creation. Right? Male and female, he created them. So it's our duty to conform to that design of creation, to procreate according to that. But more and more in our postmodern society, we're probably, maybe some would argue that we're even beyond postmodern now. We're into postmodern or metamodern or whatever, wherever we are now. We've gone from the Enlightenment where truth was enshrined as a goddess to the point now where all of that's been challenged, rejected. Objective truth has been challenged, and in many cases just completely rejected. And in its place, the idea that whatever I decide to be true is true. Whatever I feel, I can manifest my reality with my words. Poesis is a worldview foundation where that basically believes that the world is just raw material. My body is just raw material or a substance with intrinsic meaning, but the individual manipulates matter, manipulates the world to create his own purpose and meaning. This is where the idea of expressive individualism comes. The idea that, well, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body, right? So that's how I feel. So I'm going to begin living that way. In fact, I'm going to change my body. I'm going to take drugs and hormones and probably seek surgery to alter, right? It's just raw material anyway. This body, this world. It's here for me to shape into what I want it to be. That would be poesis. So these are two general ideas, foundations that can inform worldviews. So you can tell right away that the Christian worldview is in harmony with mimesis, and this progressive worldview that we see today, especially transgenderism, homosexual agenda, that's poesis. That's the idea that, well, it's whatever we want to make of it. Generally, the idea that a society has, what do people generally agree on? The web of meanings that guide our collective and individual actions and values. This is called the social imaginary. This is what everyone tends to agree on in a society. It's the prevailing meta-narrative that the greatest number of members of a group is willing to accept. Now, you tell me. Do you think that the social imaginary in the West today is more mimetic, is more in line with mimesis or poesis? Is the Christian worldview the prevailing meta-narrative, the prevailing worldview? No, it's not. It's definitely not. And in the West, anyway, it seems to be declining, while in other places it seems to be rising. China, right? Africa, places in Africa, where the Christian worldview seems to be gaining and catching hold. And I think that's fascinating when you find those things out. The way God builds his church during the pandemic, we saw faithful churches grow at rates they hadn't seen in a long time, while many unfaithful churches shut their doors and in turn lost many of their members. So under persecution, it seems, at least historically, that seems to be when the Lord grows his church. Okay. So artificial intelligence is a major element in this transhumanist movement. But is that intelligence really artificial? Now, the gentleman you saw at the beginning, the opening clip there, that was Yuval Noah Harari, who is kind of the golden boy of the World Economic Forum, the globalists. He is the one that is writing the books, giving the TED Talks. He is the lead evangelist for the transhumanist movement today. We'll talk more about him as we get into this topic a little more over the next episodes where we talk about this. We probably won't cover this in every episode, but we will revisit this regularly over the next weeks and months. But is artificial intelligence, is it really artificial? We have to ask, right? It's what is artifice? What does artificial mean, right? You have to define terms to understand what people mean. Is this artificial intelligence, is it really just another creation made in the image of man? For example, recently there was some folks got together and used AI, or really the proper term, I believe, for that today would just be machine learning. I don't think there really exists any true artificial intelligence. I believe that's an oxymoron. I don't believe there can be a such thing as artificial intelligence. But anyway, some program or something they called artificial intelligence was set up to write a film script. So I guess it studied thousands and thousands of film scripts and movies. And then it created a film script. And that script was made into a movie. And the message, one of the overall messages of this film script, was that we need less masculinity in our society. That was one of the takeaways from that script. Now, what does that tell you? Right? This is not artificial intelligence. Isn't something that's just organic. It's fed something. All this information that it has came from somewhere, and it could come from nowhere other than mind of man, the mind of men, human beings, right? And it seems like this particular artificial intelligence was mostly influenced by progressives, or those who would have a worldview founded in poiesis, right? It's the idea that we're going to shape reality according to our desires. Also, in China, citizens must wear a tracking bracelet to track health and their patterns. It's for their own good. Tracking bracelets, of course, that function according to or on somehow artificial intelligence. So, is that really there for the good of the citizen in China, or is that there to make it easier to surveil and track? some of these questions will come to answers as we talk throughout our show today. But transhumanism is a type of futurism. Right? Transhumanism is a type of futurism. It's a philosophy. And the singularity is the realization of technological fulfillment of man's growth and expansion to perfection, where biological merges with technological, and eventually the biological disappears and eternal life is achieved apart from the body. Homo Deus, or God-man, is a way to describe a potential next stage in human evolution where we control our own destinies and advance evolution with our intellect and technologies rather than being shaped by or limited by nature's mechanisms of life. So we'll talk more about Yuval Harari as this progresses. But this term, Homo Deus, God-man, could mean attaining immortality, for instance, through the use of replacement organs, cybernetics, gene manipulation, computerized brain emulation, or a combination of all of these and other means of extending life. That would be the goal, ultimately. Though the term may be relatively new, science fiction writers have long played with the idea, the philosophical ideas and consequences of man being able to shape his own biological evolution, and thus becoming their own gods, in a sense. But here in this term, Deus is being used as an adjective, and in Latin, adjectives follow the noun they describe, Deus meaning God. So this has been used as the title of a book, contrasting Homo sapiens, or knowing man, which is the scientific classification of modern humans, with Homo Deus, or God-man. The philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who wrote Leviathan, coined the phrase Homo hominum Deus for man. Man is a god. And as a reply to the famous sentence by the Roman poet Plautus, Homo hominum lupus for man. Man is a wolf. And the German philosopher, atheist Ludwig Feuerbach, placed this thought at the center of his aesthetical critique of religion. Generally, when we talk about these topics, something that I want to make sure is mentioned so that we can have a full grasp of the worldview that we're coming up against as Christians, that we need to be able to deal with, talk about, and refute, is the idea that this is hyper-reality. Hyper-reality. Now, some of you you've watched this channel for a while. You know what we're talking about there, because we've done as much as we can, especially over the past couple years, to talk about the hyper-real, because as you see around you today, you're watching this right now on a screen, on a little screen, probably a screen that you carry around with you everywhere you go. The idea is to get that screen and what comes through that screen in your head, to get it inside you, get it wired in there, so that you really can't ever get away from it. Well, first of all, you have to convince the mind. You have to seduce and deceive human beings to give away their liberty, to give away their identity. One of the ways this has been done is through taking advantage of the hyperreal. Now, whether this is by design or whether or not this is just human beings doing what they do, one can see that the iconoclasts, whom one accuses of disdaining and negating images, were those who accorded them their true value, in contrast to the iconolaters, the idolaters, who only saw reflections in them and were content to venerate a filigree god. Now, I'm reading from Jean Baudrillard, French philosopher, who wrote in the 90s He wrote a book called Simulacra and Simulation, where he describes this idea of the hyperreal very well. Essentially, it is the idea that we've lost touch with reality. We've lost touch with the real world. The most basic, whether it's exactly right or not, the most basic description or example to give is the idea of a map. If you could imagine a small island in the ocean, and the people who lived on that island made a map of the island. In fact, they made a map so accurate that it was a 1-to-1 representation of that island. And they became so used to referring to the map that they really didn't have any need or use to go to the other places on the island. And so the map becomes so valuable that they make copies of the map. And eventually, the map becomes the reality. To the point where eventually the island is lost. There is no reference to the real island anymore. And you know how the human mind works. If you've ever played the telephone game, over time our representations of things grow worse and worse. It's kind of like the old Xerox, for anyone who remembers that. The more copies you make of a thing, the less like the original it grows. So eventually, the map is there is no longer a territory. You know, maybe you've heard the map is not the territory. And so eventually what we find out here, this what you see coming through these screens, in some cases is a one-for-one representation of reality, of what's really happening in the world. Some of it you can trust. Most of it you can't. Most of it is hyper-real. In other words, think of it this way. Have you ever seen a real dinosaur? A velociraptor, for example. Well, you don't need to see a dinosaur because Steven Spielberg's made them. He's created them. He's put them in movies. And they're more real than real. Right? There is a reference to something that you've never experienced in the real world, but you think you have a real understanding of what that thing is and looks like. Fact is, if you saw one in real life, you probably would be disappointed. It wouldn't be nearly as smelly and colorful and angry and dangerous. Modern minds, the most adventurous modern minds, because in the guise of having God become apparent in the mirror of images, have begun enacting death and disappearance in the epiphany of representations. Baudrillard writes, which perhaps they already knew no longer represented anything, that they were purely a game, but that it was therein the great game lay, knowing also that it is dangerous to unmask the images, since they dissimulate the fact that there is nothing behind them. Now, this is the big goal of the World Economic Forum or globalist progressive movements, these, the banksters, we could call them today. That's one of the games they play, is to keep you focused on these images. And if you start to find that, to try to get curious to look behind the image, you start looking for truth, they just flood you with more images, more hyper-real images, more life that's more real than life. Humanity that's more human than human. This was the approach of the Jesuits, writes Baudrillard, who founded their politics on the virtual disappearance of God and on the worldly and spectacular manipulation of consciences, the evanescence of God in the epiphany of power, the end of transcendence, which now only serves as an alibi for a strategy altogether free of influences and signs. Behind the baroqueness of images hides the eminence grace of politics. This way, the stake will always have been the murderous power of images, murderers of the real, murderers of their own model, as the Byzantine icons could be those of divine identity. To this murderous power is opposed that of representations as a dialectical power, the visible and intelligible mediation of the real. All Western faith and good faith became engaged in this wager on representation, that a sign could refer to the depth of meaning, that a sign could be exchanged for the meaning, and that something could guarantee this exchange. Cryptocurrency, for example. But in this case, God is what they meant. But what if God himself can be simulated, writes Baudrillard? That is to say, can be reduced to the signs that constitute faith. Then the whole system becomes weightless. It's no longer itself anything but a gigantic simulacrum, a copy without an original. Not unreal, but a simulacrum. That is to say, never exchanged for the real, no reference to the real world, but exchanged for itself. NFTs are like this, non-fungible transactions. We're going to talk about that too. What would the economy of the new transhumanist world look like? Or not even the transhumanist world. Where are they taking money now? The CBDCs, the central bank digital currencies, is the new idea, right? The idea of blockchain and cryptocurrencies. You knew eventually, right? You knew eventually that the powers that be would have to get a hold of that and use it, centralize it somehow, right? It's like J.P. Moreland said with not J.P. Moreland. With Nikola Tesla's power, his grid, his electrical grid, and he was working on that. He actually had created a way to produce and distribute electricity wirelessly. I said J.P. Moreland. That's an apologist, but. Well, the idea was the men of industry at the time decided this can't fly. We can't have this. If you can't put a meter on it, we don't want anything to do with it. Or in fact, we're gonna hide it. We're gonna shut it down. That is to say, never exchanged for the real, but exchanged for itself in an uninterrupted circuit without reference or circumference, without any referent or any real shape itself. Such is simulation insofar as it is opposed to representation. Representation stems from the principle of the equivalence of the sign and of the real, even if this equivalence is utopian. It is a fundamental axiom. Simulation, on the contrary, stems from the utopia of the principle of equivalence, from the radical negation of the sign as value, from the sign as the reversion and death sentence of every reference. You see how these ideas and signs just build on themselves and get further and further away from the truth. In fact, the truth is redefined. Whereas representation attempts to absorb simulation by interpreting it as a false representation, simulation envelops the whole edifice of representation itself as a simulacrum. Such would be the successive phases of the image. It is the reflection of a profound reality. It masks and denatures a profound reality. Then it masks the absence of a profound reality, and it has no relation to any reality whatsoever, and then it is its own pure simulacrum. A copy without an original. It's just an idea. In fact, this is how a mind virus works. This is from The Procession of Simulacra, from the book Simulacra and Simulation, Jean Baudrillard. All right. So here, to give you an idea of where the thinking is on this this whole idea, we'll look at some quotes from Ray Kurzweil here in just a moment. You can see this one. Our sole responsibility is to produce something smarter than we are. Any problems beyond that are not ours to solve. We'll look at some more of his quotes in just a moment. Or maybe now is a good time to look at them. Let's run through those right now, because I want to, after we talk about that, I want to tell you what it is, what's the difference between this worldview and a Christian worldview, and then we're going to talk about the elephant in the room behind all of this, which is eugenics. Eugenics. You're going to hear some claims being made by the transhumanists that are, once you understand what they've said, are appalling. And you'll understand why Christians and Christian leaders, you need to be paying attention to this. Eugenics is not something from World War II that Hitler did. It's alive and well. It's right here. It's right now. Okay, let's look at this a little bit, the worldview behind this movement. Ray Kurzweil is a futurist, one of the main promoters, intelligent voices behind this movement. He says that the fate of the universe is a decision that's yet to be made. In fact, it's one that we will intelligently make when we feel like it, or when the time is right, as he says. So we'll decide the fate of the universe, human beings. How about that? The only way this could make it into the public realm and get any sort of consideration as an intelligent statement is if over time our education system has been destroyed. And how has it been destroyed? Well, think about this. It used to be that in our academic institutions, in our universities, theology was the queen of the sciences. It was at the top. Theology, the study of God, the doctrine of God, understanding God, trying to study and know more about the Creator so that you can understand more about His creation. So theology was at the top, and all disciplines under that. Under theology was anthropology, but below that was the study of man. And what happened over time was that somehow or another that anthropology got pushed up on top of theology, and it became about man and man's ideas. The mind of man is the epitome. And so underneath that flowed things like religious studies and gender studies and whatever else. But here's the idea. Think about this. Theology, when studied, when time is spent on theology, think about the Creator of the universe and all that's in it. Now, that's a powerful being. So if you have theology at the top, then you have what you're studying, what you're learning is broad. It's universal. It's a university, after all. But if you limit your learning, you limit your study to anthropology is at the top, right? And under anthropology comes then cosmology, right? It's all filtered through our minds. Well, then think about as you look at the universe and you see this tiny speck of an earth. That's the limit of your knowledge. That tiny dot out there, that pale blue dot that Carl Sagan mentioned. That's the limit of your knowledge. That's the limit of your education. That pale blue dot. But if theology is at the top, then you have the whole universe. You're going to learn about mind and matter and everything beyond. But Ray Kurzweil here is one of these of the worldview where I would venture to say probably poesis, where he believes that the world is just raw material. Right, here you go. It's just raw material or a substance that we manipulate for our own, to create our own purpose and meaning. Kurzweil also says that biological evolution is just too slow. It's a lot like this book. This book by Jorgen Randers that we've shared with you here a few times. This is the follow-up to the Club of Rome's Limits to Growth paper from 40 years ago. 2052, and this book tells you, they tell you this is the globalist perspective for the next 40 years, the agenda for the 21st century. And they tell you in there plainly, democracy moves too slow. We've got to come up with something new. You heard Harari at the opening of the show say, we have to re-engineer, reimagine democracy for this new world. Ray Kurzweil thinks the same thing about evolution. It's just too slow. We're going to have to begin to engineer it. If you ask Ray Kurzweil, does God exist? He will tell you, not yet. He believes that we will create God. Now, what kind of God is that? I ask you. So for the Christian, the Bible is it is a coherent corpus of truth. For the Christian, the Bible is the coherent corpus of truth, revealed to man by God, his creator and sustainer. It contains all relevant truth for knowledge of God, salvation, and how one should live in this world that's hostile to God and his people. The Bible doesn't tell us exactly what consciousness is, but it does tell us why we have it and what to do with it and what not to do with it. For the futurist, the mind of man is the only creator and source of truth. His collected corpus of truth is found in his science and his philosophy. For the transhumanist, biotechnology and information technology are the corpus of truth that will lead to this synthetic salvation, or when man learns how to leave behind his body and consciously enter the digital realm where, according to his limited corpus of truth, immortality is possible. Synthetic salvation. Or you could say it's a form of Gnosticism where the immediate special knowledge of God is the direct connection of one's consciousness to all information, all available information. But we need to back up for a moment. This is where we need to stop and define some terms. We must know more about these terms and the kind of thinking that has led us to this crucial point in the history of the human race. No discussion of technology, transcendence, and the process of perfecting humanity would be complete without understanding one of the primary motivating sciences behind all of this. That is eugenics. Eugenics is at the heart of transhumanism. Question is, what role, if any, should society have in trying to improve the human species. So let's look at some examples. Let's look at some people who really believe that eugenics is a good thing. First of all, let's let them tell you their position, and then I'll offer for you an explanation of why this is awful, why it's just crazy. So first of all, this is Dr. or Professor Michael Sandel. All right, and first of all, actually, we're going to hear him introduced by, don't remember this gentleman's name, but he's going to say it right here. So let's listen to this. We're going to listen to a minute or two of this, and then we'll come back and comment on it. Pay attention to what you hear. This is going to be a discussion about the new eugenics, the good. You know, the prefix EU there implies good genetics, right? Controlling good genetics. I'm going to define for you what eugenics is after we listen to this. But the title of this lecture is The Brave New World of Designer Children, Bionic Athletes, and Genetic Engineering. Let's listen to a couple minutes.
Tonight we'll discuss the title, The New Eugenics, The Brave New World of Designer Children, Bionic Athletes, and Genetic Engineering. Now, as a former Secretary of Agriculture, I am familiar with both the benefits as well as the alleged detriments of genetic engineering when it comes to crops and livestock. While the debate over agriculture-related engineering was and is intense, it pales in comparison to the debate we face when it comes to human genetic engineering. Which reminds me, I recently looked at my new grandson. He was beautiful, of course, and as I gazed at him, I wondered about what his life would be like, what familial traits of mine he would carry on. I could see him one day growing up to be 6'4", with a thick head of blonde hair and big blue eyes.
Oh, no.
Like any father or grandfather, I wondered...
You have to stop there, don't you? I mean, there's nothing inherently wrong with blonde hair and blue eyes, but okay, I mean, that's a little bit cliche when you're at a eugenics conference, right?
Which gifts would he be able to share with the rest of the world? And up until just a few years ago, that's how many parents looked at their children's future. It was a crapshoot. It was luck. A parent couldn't control his own genetics or his kid's genetics or nature. Well, that's probably not true anymore. The discussion we'll have this evening and the debate countless scholars and theologians...
In fact, it's never been true that it's a crapshoot, right? It's not a crapshoot. It's never been. It's never been just pure chance, has it? So that's a fallacy right off the bat.
...are having around the world is profound. Do we dare play God? Do we want a boy or a girl? Would you like your child to be taller or of medium height, green eyes or blue? If we do play God, how far should we go? And if we go too far, what will that do to society? It's ironic, or perhaps perfectly appropriate, that we're having this debate at a time when we are witnessing an emergence of religious fundamentalism in the United States. That is a movement where many believe that only God should be the one to decide these questions, not human beings.
There you go. There is the that's going to be the biggest problem that this movement has in the world. It's you. It's you, Christian. Now they're going to call Christian. They're going to call you the religious fundamentalist. Where that term fundamentalist has been kicked around and turned into a pejorative term. In fact, my friends, there is absolutely nothing wrong with being, with fundamentally being a Christian, right? In other words, all that means is getting the basics right. Who is Jesus? Who did he say he was? Who is God? Who did he say he was? Who are we? Who did the one who created us say we are? These are fundamentals, right? These are fundamentals of the faith. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with saying that homosexuality is a sin. There's nothing wrong with saying that it's deplorable to push children into transgenderism. Right? But today, these ideas are well, they're looked on as though you are either mentally ill, if you have these ideas, you're crazy, you're mentally ill, or you're the enemy. Because you're holding back our evolution, they'll say. There's nothing wrong with being a fundamentalist, friends.
To help us understand the challenges ahead of us in this brave new world, we are pleased to have some of the best minds in this field. First, we will hear a short talk from Professor Michael Sandel, and then we will hear brief responses from Professor Stephen Pinker and Brent Coffin. We will have a brief conversation on stage, and then we'll open it up to Q&As. Let me introduce Professor Sandel. Many of you already know him. His undergraduate course on justice has enrolled over 10,000 students, making it one of the most popular courses in Harvard's history. In 1985, he was awarded the Harvard Radcliffe Phi Beta Kappa Teaching Prize.
Okay, so he got his introduction now. I'm going to push on into a little bit about what he's saying here. Move up here to this point.
A laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania that has super strong, bulked up mice. These are researchers there have found a way of triggering the gene that controls muscle growth. They were hoping to come up with a cure for muscular dystrophy. But among those who are most interested in their bulked up mice are coaches and athletes, because the same gene therapy that would cure atrophied muscles would also work, and it's worked in the mice, in perfectly healthy muscles to make them even stronger. So question number one, what about genetically altered athletes? It's not all that hypothetical. Even now we read lots about steroid-enhanced athletes hitting more home runs than Babe Ruth ever was able to hit.
Okay. All right, so there's that piece. Now, let's move on to the next part here about cognition enhancers. Cognition enhancers, right about here.
Companies, biotech companies, that are trying to develop what they call cognition enhancers, ways of intervening genetically to improve the memory, or at least some features of memory, for human beings. Now, their market is not only those who have Alzheimer's. It's not only a matter of therapy and repair. The much bigger market consists of those
who just want it, right? That's what he's going to describe. People who, he's going to say that those who age and see the decline in their ability to keep up mentally, but of course, many other applications for that. As you'll hear as we move on in this, let's move on now to choosing the sex of a child and find out where did that technology come from. And there's an important point here that I want to point out to you. There's a section in U.S. Code that was put in there. I'll share it. I'll try to share it with you the next time that we're on here. I think I can actually pull it up here. I'll pull it up here on my phone. I'll carry this around with me to share with people because it's so shocking. Well, this is U.S. Code Title 42, Section 1981. This is probably not the one I'm looking for, but this one also. Statement of equal rights under the law. All persons within the jurisdiction of the United States shall have the same right in every state and territory to make and enforce contracts, to sue, be parties, give evidence, and to the full and equal benefit of all laws and proceedings for the security of persons and property as is enjoyed by white citizens. You thought I made that up. Look up U.S. Code Title 42, Section 1981. It continues, and shall be subject to like punishment, pains, penalties, taxes, licenses, and exactions of every kind, and to no other. That's just a statement that with your rights, there will be duties expected of you as well. One of those duties, as you get into U.S. Code and learn a little more about it, one of those duties, for all of these rights that we get, that we certainly do enjoy, the leaders have gotten a little, over time, they've become a little more devious with every generation. And it states plainly in U.S. Code that those people who have birth certificates are classified as citizens within within the United States, within that jurisdiction, within that corporate limitation, are qualified as as livestock. This is so that, or are equated to be as livestock. The reason that this was put in there is so that certain experiments could be done on the population without any recourse coming to the government or the government agencies that did it. We'll talk more about that here in just a minute when we get into eugenics and Margaret Sanger. But let's listen to this and where this idea of choosing the sex of a child, the moral implications, something called microsort, where it's a sperm sorting technology. You'll be interested to know where that technology came from.
Fourth case, also already practiced. You can now choose the sex of your children. This is something you can look forward to. For millennia, people have been coming up with folk remedies to choose a boy or a girl, but now it's possible in two ways at least. One way is for those who go through in vitro fertilization, there is genetic screening of the embryos, embryo screening, to check for diseases before implanting one of them. But while they're checking, they can also check for the sex and implant only the embryo of the desired sex. That's 100% effective. It's easy to check for. There's another way that doesn't even require people to go through in vitro fertilization, sperm sorting. There's a company, it's a for-profit company in Fairfax, Virginia, that if you want to choose the sex of your child, they collect the sperm and they can separate, they run it through a machine, and the machine can separate the Y-bearing sperm from the X-bearing sperm, and through artificial insemination, use the sperm of the desired sex. And it's pretty effective, 91% effective for those who want girls, about 75% for those who try for boys. So what about sex selection? And by the way, Secretary Glickman will be interested to know that this technique, this sperm sorting machine, was first developed, guess where? In the Department of Agriculture, for breeding cattle. But some smart entrepreneurs saw a bigger market. They licensed the technology, and now they let people choose the sex of their kids. Now, the bigger question for the wider society is, how would social practices and the relation between parents and children be changed if people became accustomed to choosing the sex of their kids in advance, and for that matter, in principle, depending on how the genetic mapping goes, other genetic traits, height, hair color, eye color, propensity for obesity or dyslexia, or ultimately, this now borders into much more distant scenarios, intelligence or athletic prowess. There's a science fiction movie, Gattaca, which some of you may have seen. We have a short clip here just to give us an imaginative sense of what a routine practice of sex selection and selection for other genetic traits through embryo screening might look like. So if we have the clip, maybe you can run it now, then see what you think. So
you're not going to get to see the Gattaca clip. They're gonna, for copyright reasons, they won't put that up there. But that brings us up to where the moral implications of what we're talking about. He starts talking about that a little bit more. The name of the company, he mentions the name of the company. It's called Microsort, sperm sorting technology that began in cattle breeding. And he goes on to talk about the moral implications. It said, but so far, this is only being used, they won't allow anybody to use this service except if they want to balance a family. They've already had 3 boys and, they want to have a girl. Listen, do you think for a second if Elon Musk shows up with his checkbook, they're going to turn him down? I mean, of course it's not. The moral implications of this are, they're far-reaching. So we're going to move ahead here to the proverbial money shot. Here you go. Here you're going to hear Dr. Sandel speak about mastery. About mastery and control and dominion. leading into the comment on eugenics. Let's listen to this.
Here's my stab at making some sense of what is troubling beyond fairness and discrimination. I think it has something to do, though it reaches very far, this account, so you may not gravitate to it instantly. I think it has something to do with a certain access to a project that in many ways we're very committed to in modern societies, a project of mastery and control over nature, including now even human nature.
So what he wants to say here, what he's trying to deal with is he knows there are people who are not going to agree with this. He knows that there are going to be objections. They know that those religious fundamentalists out there are standing in their way. Listen, Christians are not anti-science. If you want to know the truth about it, it was Christians who brought you the foundations of science that you now stand on. So we're not anti-science in any way. We just believe that your science, your study, the way you use your science. Science is a tool. So the way you use the tool of science needs to be informed by a Christian worldview, or you're going to get into problems. These moral questions are going to be difficult to answer. You're going to have to poll the room and find out who thinks this is good and bad. You don't know. You're not really sure. So it becomes down, what is the answer, or the way they decide becomes, well, what's best for mankind? What do we think is best for mankind? How do we reduce suffering? And then it morphs into, how do we gain an advantage?
There is an ethic since the Enlightenment that understands freedom as a kind of mastery over the world, over nature, and sees the extension of human control and even dominion as the working out of our freedom. But what our hesitation in the face of genetic enhancement and sex selection suggests may be connected to an understanding that ethic by itself, that ethic of mastery and dominion, is incomplete, and that it has to live in tension with another ethic, an ethic that views at least certain important things in life, and maybe even including certain parts of nature and our nature, as gifts for which we're indebted, rather than as projects that we control. One way of describing, or at least naming, this objection would be to call it the hubris objection. And one way of explaining the way in which it's a hubris objection is to go back to the case of the sex selection, picking the genetic traits of children. The idea is this: to appreciate children as gifts is, at least to a certain point, to accept them as they come, not to cast them as objects of our design, or products of our will, or instruments of our ambition. Now, when we think about our friends, or partners, or spouses, we choose our friends and spouses at least partly on the basis of qualities that we find attractive. But we don't choose our children, and that's an important fact about them and about us. Their qualities are unpredictable, and even the most conscientious parents can't be held wholly responsible for the kind of child they have. Because
where he goes here is interesting. He goes on to say that the moral argument here is, how would this affect the relationship between children and parents if we could just choose sex of our child? And if you'll notice, interesting here that he never once mentions selecting the gender of the child, because there's good reason for that. This was April 7th, 2004. This is when this was. Okay. Now, this is where we get into eugenics. Let's go to this mark right here. Listen to what he says right here, and then I'll come back and help you with some definitions.
Sure, freedom to which we're committed. But consider, just to make it more intuitively plausible, a historic practice, not all that different from genetic engineering, eugenics. One way of casting the moral argument about an openness to the unbidden is to ask, was there anything wrong with eugenics after all? Now, it's true the Nazis and Hitler gave eugenics a bad name because they carried it into genocide. Earlier in the 20th century, eugenics was a very respectable, in progressive circles, a respectable movement.
Did you catch that? Eugenics was a very respectable movement.
What's wrong with you people?
For reform, Theodore Roosevelt was an enthusiastic eugenicist. Margaret Sanger, an early feminist, was a eugenicist. The point of birth control, she said, was to increase the number of the fit rather than the unfit.
Okay, what was that again? Margaret Sanger was an early feminist. Right. Early feminist, Margaret Sanger. Let's hear that one more time.
Margaret Sanger, an early feminist, was a eugenicist. The point of birth control, she said, was to increase the number of the fit rather than the unfit. So,
she said the point of birth control was to just increase the number of fit, to reduce the number of unfit. Well, he goes on to talk here to say that, as you heard him say, eugenics was really a good thing. It was just unfairly sullied by the Nazis. And he says here that Margaret Sanger, he mentions a couple other eugenicists.
Eugenics, it has a checkered career, a dark past, connected to forced sterilization and to genocide. But suppose...
Let's skip over, forced and genocide. I'm how fast he moved through the genocide. Folks, that genocide is going on now. That's what Planned Parenthood is.
Suppose we detached from eugenics the coercion.
Now, could you ever do that? See, he talks about two sins here. One of them is coercion. What if you had eugenics minus the coercion? What if you could actually do this without forcing people, without doing it behind their back, without sterilizing people without them knowing? Surely nothing like this has ever happened in the United States. Well, it has. It's happened a lot. If you read about the Tuskegee experiment, syphilis experiment in the South, it's on this channel. If you want to know more about that, the details, you can find that. There's a clip video. Find it right there in our playlists. Well, the U.S. government certainly did that, and they did it legally, according to U.S. code. You find out that a lot of these things that happened, especially things that happened in the Nazi regime, were legal. They had passed the laws to allow it to be so ahead of time. But he does mention here Margaret Sanger. He goes on to talk about mastery of our progeny, having dominion, the idea that our dominion, us taking dominion over reverence. Right, and he talks about the fact that we need to share his faith that he's presenting here, it needs to be shared with others. So I think he mentions some other names here.
Suppose we detach from eugenics state imposition and control. Then, would it be okay? In fact, some would argue one way of seeing these...
In fact, he's saying, why don't we just privatize eugenics? Why don't we put it in the hands of the corporations? Listen to this.
Modern technologies of genetic enhancement is as free market eugenics.
Free market
privatized eugenics.
Privatized eugenics.
Minus the coercion, minus the collective state imposition.
How about that? Well, folks, that already exists. It's abortion. Well, recently, in a surprise a happy surprise for a lot of us, Roe versus Wade overturned recently, but eugenics is still alive and well. And there are people in the streets today demanding that their right to be a eugenicist be respected. Now, before I go into Margaret Sanger here, let's just keep in mind that when we're talking about the idea here of genetic manipulation and transhumanism, essentially determining now remember, this transhumanism ultimately is not eugenics, but eugenics is a part of transhumanism, because we're talking about only the best will have access to this. So we have to be aware that for example, the most debilitating birth defects Now, this makes a strong case for human augmentation. It makes it difficult if you don't have a consistent worldview to decide, how do I think about this? But the assumption here, the assumption that humanity is going to handle these capabilities ethically, is far-fetched. It's far-fetched, for sure. So let's talk about Miss Margaret Sanger for just a bit. What is eugenics? Eugenics is the selection of desired heritable characteristics in order to improve future generations, typically in reference to humans. But as you heard a minute ago, it was originally in reference to cattle. Well, so that doesn't sound too bad, does it? We're just selecting desired traits to improve our future generations, right? Well, atheists like Richard Dawkins have said that, eugenics was only used among cattle, so that, you can't use that term anymore the way you were using it. Well, that's, he said the common term is breeding or raising. It was never used on humans, but the term eugenics was coined in 1883 by British explorer and natural scientist Francis Galton, who, influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, advocated a system that would allow, quote, the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable. This we call today social Darwinism, the popular theory in the late 19th century that life for humans in society was ruled by the survival of the fittest, helped advance eugenics into serious scientific study in the early 1900s. By World War I, many scientific authorities and political leaders supported eugenics, as the professor said there. However, it ultimately failed as a science in the 1930s and 40s, when the assumptions of eugenicists became heavily criticized, and the Nazis used eugenics to support the extermination of entire races. Today, we like to pretend that eugenics was just a dark period of our ignorant past. But the truth is, it's alive and well. Eugenics is alive and well in the hearts and minds of many who have nothing of substance in which to ground their idea of morality. Those who lack the objective morality of an objective moral lawgiver. Subjective moral values lead to ideals like eugenics. To assume that eugenics has gone the way of the dinosaur is to naively ignore the true state of affairs. Eugenics, or properly dysgenics, is alive and well and cleverly masked under the kinder, gentler monikers of genetics or Planned Parenthood. In 1921, Margaret Sanger founded the American Birth Control League, and she served as its president until 1928. The League was one of the parent organizations of the Birth Control Federation of America, which in 1942 became the Planned Parenthood Federation of America, with Sanger as the honorary chairman. Sanger, who had traveled to Europe to study the issue of birth control there, right? You're going to study eugenics, go to the ones who go to the pros. You go to Germany. She also organized the first World Population Conference in Geneva, Switzerland in 1927. She was the first president of the International Planned Parenthood Federation, founded in 1953. Planned Parenthood now operates the largest abortion business in the country. What does that business do? It sells body parts. That's what the business does. It's not a service, it's a for-profit corporation. It has played a central role in lobbying for the decriminalization of abortion and turning Planned Parenthood into a billion-dollar corporation along the way. In 1922, Margaret Sanger published her book, The Pivot of Civilization, which revealed the unabashed contempt she harbored towards anyone who didn't measure up to her genetic standards. This is where we get down to that question, by what standard? According to what standard are you deciding what's good and what's bad? Who's accepted and who's not? Who gets the new technology? Who doesn't? She believed that the best way to eliminate poverty and suffering was to eliminate the poor and oppressed by breeding them out. While Sanger seemed to play up to being sincerely distressed by the collective suffering of women and children, she was not concerned at all with helping them. Her stated goal was to eradicate them. In her own words, to quote, put them out of their misery. This is what she wrote in her book, Pivot of Civilization. She said, "We become fully cognizant of the burden of the imbecile upon the whole human race when we see the funds that should be available for human development being diverted," I'll interject here, wasted annually by hundreds of millions of dollars to the care and segregation of men, women, and children who never should have been born. Right? Professor here just said that she was, an early feminist, strong voice out there, someone that we need to pay attention to, right? Is his mind just darkened? Well, how could you stand there and say that to a room full of people? Unless you just didn't know what you were talking about. And it's hard to believe that the professor there doesn't know what he's talking about. At the present time, Sanger says, speaking in her day in the 20s, she says, at the present time, civilized nations are penalizing talent and genius, the bearers of the torch of civilization, in order to coddle and perpetuate the choking human undergrowth. Right? She's talking about people. In order to coddle and perpetuate the choking human undergrowth, which, as all authorities tell us, is escaping control and threatens to overrun the whole garden of humanity. She doesn't even consider them to be human. Complaining about the social cost of caring for the feeble-minded men and women, women and children, Sanger refers to them as dead weight of human waste in her, and Margaret Sanger in The Religion of Birth Control in that book. In a perversion of Christ's Sermon on the Mount, Sanger asserts that a corrupt tree cannot bring forth good fruit. Every tree which bringeth not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Oh boy. Blasphemy of blasphemies. In other words, no amount of pruning can improve a genetically corrupt tree, or in this case, a genetically corrupt human being. There's no question about where Margaret Sanger and her legacy, Planned Parenthood, stand with regard to favored races. The eugenicist Margaret Sanger points out that heredity is the great determining factor in the lives of men and women. You may bring all the changes possible on nurture or environment, but comparatively little can be affected until you control biological and hereditary elements of the problem. There is every indication that feeble-mindedness in its protean forms is on the increase, that it has leaped the barriers, and that there is truly, as some of the scientific eugenicists have pointed out, a feeble-minded peril to future generations, unless the feeble-minded are prevented from reproducing their kind. That's the great Margaret Sanger, who is lauded as the great feminist, right? That's who she is. Is it any wonder today that we see an angry anti-intellectual movement that cannot state or defend their position or even hold a meaningful conversation about the matter? Through Sanger as their dubious prophet, they place themselves in charge of determining which humans are worthy of life and which are not. Most do not even realize that that's the argument they're endorsing. Also known officially as the Tuskegee study of untreated syphilis in the Negro male, there was a 40-year experiment run by public health service officials that followed 600 rural black men in Alabama with syphilis over the course of their lives, refusing to tell these men their diagnosis, refusing to treat them for the disease that if they didn't already have it, that they gave them, and actively denying some of them treatment. Whistleblowers brought an end to the incredibly unethical study in 1972, finally prompting the development of what would become modern medical ethics. But the lives of those black men and many of their families were mostly ruined. Many of the men died from complications of syphilis, and several of their wives and children contracted the disease as well. So it's an apt comparison in the eyes of the black abortion activists, black anti-abortion activists, many of whom argue that Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger was a supporter of eugenics, who some say worked to intentionally lower the black birth rate. It's known to be a fact at this point. That black women are far more likely than women of other races to get an abortion is, to the black anti-abortion movement, proof that something is amiss. And so we talked about this yesterday, how there's definitely a movement of population control and control of certain segments of society. Look at these statistics. This abortion data for 2019, the abortion rate for white women is 11.7%, black women 38.6%. That is 386 abortions per 1,000 live births. It's almost 40% of the time when an African-American woman gets pregnant that it will end in abortion. As I said yesterday, that is less a comment on promiscuity and more a commentary on how they're marketed to by these movements. So do you think it's dead and gone? Don't have to worry about that stuff anymore? Look at this. Transgender surgery is poised to become a $5 billion industry. There is no neutral position on this, my friends. This is cold, hard reality. Politicians and civic leaders at the federal and state levels, now that Roe versus Wade has been overturned, are going to be forced to publicly take a definitive position. Right? And look at this. The industry surrounding transgender surgeries is expected to reach $5 billion by the end of the decade. This is 7 more years. According to a recent report from Grandview Research, the sector saw a $1.9 billion valuation last year and is forecast to expand at a compound annual growth rate of more than 11% through 2030. Referring to a separate study from the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in L.A., the analysis claimed that 78% of transgender males, females who identify as the opposite sex, experienced gender dysphoria by the age of 7. Why? Because it's everywhere. It's all they hear, especially in school. Demand for gender-affirming operations is slated to accelerate in the coming years as hospitals resume non-emergency services, according to Grandview Research. Many patients are likewise receiving consultations via telehealth. You don't even have to show up. How easy is it to get these hormone blockers? How easy is it to get these hormones that people need? A phenomenon called anticipated to have a beneficial impact on the growth of the market in the upcoming years. While insurance companies such as Aetna and Unicare may cover some components of sex reassignment surgeries, including hysterectomies and ovaryectomies, GVR said that government support is also driving the market. Government support is also driving the market through Medicare coverage. The report comes amidst scrutiny of hospitals that provide transgender medical services to young people, particularly when they offer such services to children. Daily Wire host Matt Walsh recently obtained footage showing a Vanderbilt doctor emphasizing the money such surgeries can bring in. Quote, chest reconstruction surgeries, which can be performed on minors, can generate $40,000, and female-to-male bottom surgeries can produce $100,000. Another Vanderbilt doctor called religious objections to this problematic and said that medical professionals who refuse to perform such surgeries should face consequences. Are these the transhumanists? The revelations have since garnered the attention of state and federal lawmakers. Senator Marsha Blackburn said, using children for profit and political gain is deeply disturbing. Experts agree that there have not been enough clinical trials conducted to prove the safety and effectiveness of using these drugs on kids. These drugs have not been approved for treating children experiencing gender dysphoria. Are they really experiencing gender dysphoria? Now, there might be a very small percentage that are, but are all of these children really experiencing gender dysphoria, or are they experiencing the results, the effects of the hyper-real influence on their minds? Studies indicate that as many as 90% of young people who claim a transgender identity but are not encouraged to socially or medically transition will no longer call themselves transgender in just a few years. All right. Big problem, folks. Big problem. And here's what Matt Walsh uncovered. Video and archived web pages from the medical center details the doctor's promotion of the big moneymaker of transgender therapies. So this was at Vanderbilt. He says, quote, it's a lot of money, VUMC Clinic for Transgender Health's Dr. Shane Siebold Taylor said at one Medicine Grand Rounds lecture. He said, these surgeries make a lot of money. Taylor noted that chest reconstruction, we just told you how much they're worth. Some clinics are entirely supported financially by phalloplasty surgeries, that is the male surgery. These surgeries are labor intensive. There are a lot of follow-ups. They require a lot of our time, and they make money. They make money for the hospital. At another Medicine Grand Rounds lecture, staffers were warned by Vanderbilt health law expert Ellen Wright Clayton that any conscientious objection will be met with consequences, and are told that they probably shouldn't be working at VUMC if they don't want to participate in the trans surgeries, which include minor patients, children. If you're going to assert conscientious objection, you have to realize that that is problematic, she said. You're doing something to another person and you're not paying the cost for your belief. I think that is a real issue, she said. He said, I just want you to take home that saying that you're not going to do something because you're conscientious, because of your religious beliefs. It is not without consequences and should not be without consequences, she stressed. I just want to put that out there. This is America, folks. She says, we're given an enormous, she stopped. If you don't want to do this kind of work, don't work at Vanderbilt. I think she probably stopped herself before we give to make a lot of money here. This medical center has a program called TransBuddy, which is also available for minors and described as a sort of monitoring system of the center's doctors, including the policing of their pronoun use. So on and on, you can see that what they're actually up to and what they're doing there. Now, moving on along here as we look at some of these, just some of the headlines of some of the stories that are out there now. This is recently the Brain Initiative 2.0, from cells to circuits. This is the got my notes over here. The National Institutes of Health announced a $600 million funding initiative for an expansive and ongoing push to unravel the mysteries of the human brain. So we're talking about what the hospital's doing, pushing these treatments onto kids. This is part of the same movement because it all feeds the same beast. And here, a little more directly into transhumanism, scientists across the country are involved, from teams at the Salk Institute to Duke University. So far, questions have proven easier to ask than answer, with researchers gleaning bits of information from individual studies, but the hope is that a broad-based effort will jumpstart new revelations. So this funding adds to the $2.4 billion that the National Institutes of Health invested in related projects. By 2026, the agency will have spent $5 billion on trying to map the brain. This initiative was unveiled by the Obama administration in 2013. It was kicked off in 2014, and its goal is to better understand the 86 billion cells that populate the brain and the trillions of connections they form with each other. Joe Ngai, the director of the Brain Initiative, said it's arguably the most sophisticated computer that we know. It's a highly complex organ whose connections and organizational principles we do not come close to understanding, and there was a realization that we needed better tools. So once again, as Christians, we're here to tell you that we're not anti-science. But what is the worldview, right? The same people here are the same people over here pushing these surgeries onto the children. We have to ask the question, okay, you want to map the brain. What are you going to do with that? What worldview do you have? What about the lady who's running this here at Vanderbilt, who was threatening people not to speak out about this? Is it important that we know what her worldview is so that we can counter it, so that we can offer a refutation? NIH launches the next stage of its Human Genome Project for the brain. They say it's in the same of the same significance and size that the Human Genome Project was. So just to let you know that's there, that's something that they're working on. Of course, the idea there is to create, if you can map the brain, that's not a bad thing to want to map the brain, to want to do that. I'm not saying that that's evil in of itself. But does Klaus Schwab want to map your brain? Like, what is he gonna do with that information? Well, Klaus Schwab says the Great Reset will lead to implantable microchips that will read your thoughts. As to Schwab and his transhumanism, his own website tells us all we need to know about his plans to move beyond the merely human, to harness high tech, and to luxuriate in everything from implantable microchips to smart dust. His views are grotesque. He speaks often about the Fourth Industrial Revolution, a blend of digital and analog life. This means a mix of humans and artificial intelligence, and emphasis on nanotechnology and eugenics, and a rewriting of what it means to be human. Or as Schwab puts it, quote, what the Fourth Industrial Revolution will lead to is a fusion of our physical, digital, and biological identity. As one report on all this puts it, quote, in the book, Schwab explains with excitement how upcoming technology will allow authorities to intrude into the hitherto private space of our minds, reading our thoughts and influencing our behavior. He goes on to predict that this will provide an incentive for law enforcement to implement Minority Report style pre-crime programs. As capabilities in this area improve, the temptation for law enforcement agencies and courts to use techniques to determine the likelihood of criminal activity assess guilt, or even possibly retrieve memories directly from people's brains will increase, says Klaus Schwab. He says even crossing a national border might one day involve a detailed brain scan to assess an individual's security risk. Bring this up because we heard the professor a minute ago say, look, if we could just remove all the coercion, we could really have a good eugenics here. It reminds us of George H.W. Bush saying, you know, we really got a shot at this New World Order. That's for summer. So we're being asked to trust these fallible, self-selected experts, so-called experts, with the future of our entire civilization. Overnight, our society is doing what radical leftist Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and her fellow Green New Deal fanatics have demanded: an almost total end to air travel, personal automobile travel, down to a trickle, promises of free health care for all. Boy, after we've seen here tonight, looking forward to that, becoming the new status quo. And the ability of people to sit at home without working and receive a paycheck from the government with your brain implants. C.S. Lewis, in a number of books and articles, warned about where we're heading as new technologies, coupled with increased statism, spelled the abolition of man. And that was the title of his 1947 book. In it, he said this, quote, "What we call man's power over nature turns out to be power exercised by some men over other men with nature as its instrument." He continued, quote, "Man's conquest of nature, if the dreams of some scientific planners are realized, means the rule of a few hundred men over billions upon billions of men. There neither is nor can be any simple increase of power on man's side. Each new power won by man is a power over man as well." And in his third volume in his space trilogy was all about rogue science and unethical technocrats. In The Hideous Strength, 1946, it was a clear warning about coming coercive dystopias. The evil organization NICE is the villain in the novel. The National Institute for Coordinated Experiments, NICE, is a government bureaucracy established to help mankind. But aren't they all? It, of course, does nothing of the sort. Several quotes can be offered here. One makes the point of how euphemisms and subterfuge are always the weapons of choice for these technocrats. We want you to write it down, to camouflage it. Only for the present, of course. Once the thing gets going, we shan't have to bother about the great heart of the British public. We'll make the great heart what we want it to be. But in the meantime, it does make a difference how things are put. For instance, if it were even whispered that the NICE wanted powers to experiment on criminals, you'd have all the old women of both sexes up in arms and yapping about humanity. Call it re-education of the maladjusted, and you have them all slobbering with delight that the brutal era of retributive punishment has at last come to an end. Odd thing is, the word experiment is unpopular, but not the word experimental. You mustn't experiment on children, but offer the dear little kiddies free education in an experimental school attached to the NICE organization, and it's all good. The physical sciences, good and innocent in themselves, had already begun to be warped, says Lewis. They had been subtly maneuvered in a certain direction. Despair of objective truth had been increasingly insinuated into the scientists, indifference to it, and a concentration upon more power had been the result. The very experiences of the dissecting room and the pathological laboratory were breeding a conviction that the stifling of all deep-set repugnances was the first essential for progress. So get them used to it. Slowly, you have to boil the frog. This is more about Schwab with his dreams of microchipping the world. It's Time magazine, right after the pandemic, talking about the Great Reset, how pandemic has provided a unique opportunity to think about the kind of future we want. So Time partnered with the World Economic Forum to ask leading thinkers, right? Leading thinkers, right? Not eugenicists but leading thinkers, to share ideas how to transform the way we live and work. So you can see this for yourself if you like. It's time.com. How it's all positioned as this great reset, this great opportunity for humanity to change, and it just all happened naturally. We're just responding, to what happened naturally. What is the truth? Is transhumanism really? Is it really liberation? Are we willing to sacrifice our humanity in the name of advancement? Smartphones grant access to a world of roadmaps and obviate the need for self-orientation. Right? We've forgotten how to use a map. Can't think our way around a city anymore. We have to have a device to show us where to go. What about when that device is implanted in your head? I guess that would be convenient, right? And it would just be there. Unless also in that head of yours were thoughts that the elite didn't like, and they could turn it off. The human memory is no longer required to store or recall very much now. That vast resources of information are only a mouse click away. We've already willingly given up so much in the name of access and convenience that we barely notice each time we're asked to surrender a little more. So the transhumanist push towards a reimagining of the humanity, and our shared future is a primary component of three growing cultural trends: artificial intelligence, human augmentation, and the transgender phenomenon. The means of effecting these transformative developments are entirely technical and promise liberation from reproduction, liberation from disease and mortality, and liberation from the body itself. AI technology is pushing for humans to be artificially gestated. The ongoing effort to change language and redefine male and female so they refer to something other than sexual dimorphism is designed to establish a Cartesian mind-body dualism in which the mind can dominate body to such an extent that personal subjectivity can decisively contradict a biological reality. In the current cultural climate, to question the concept of transgenderism is to question the right of an individual to exist. This is an extremely effective strategy that deters the skeptic from digging in to an ideology by labeling them bigots or insane, perhaps. The implications of transgenderism are so serious and far-reaching that questions must be asked. That's what we're trying to do here. It's not simply about societal acceptance of people with alternative views or lifestyles, but the most fundamental aspects of what it means to be human. Transhumanism, or H+, is an international philosophical movement that advocates for the transformation of the human condition by developing and making widely available sophisticated technologies to greatly enhance human intellect and physiology. The most common transhumanist thesis is that human beings may eventually be able to transform themselves into different beings with abilities so greatly expanded from the current condition as to merit the label of post-human beings. The agenda is upon us, my friends. The transhumanist push towards a reimagining of the humanity, and our shared future is a primary component of these three growing cultural trends that we've mentioned: AI, human augmentation, the transgender phenomenon. It's no anomaly that the movement is hitting its cultural stride in the debate over pronouns. The first step in changing how we think about our bodies and what it means to be human is to change how we speak about these things. Transgender speech codes demand that we renounce our body's basis in biology and instead consider them constructs of arbitrary and somehow unjust societal expectations. There you go. We're back around to full circle. We're not to think about mother and father as reproductive terms, but as culturally specified relationships. The aggressive effort to change and police the use of language and to redefine terms like male and female to deny the sexual difference characteristic of all mammals is designed to uncouple the mind from the body and humans from evolutionary and reproductive logic. Instead, an ideology of emotion is to be given dominion over biological reality. With the widespread acceptance of human augmentation, biotech, artificial intelligence, and transgenderism, we are removing agency from the human body and granting it entirely to the mind. The concerns we perceive to be on the fringes of culture or esoteric and only vaguely relevant to some distant future are in fact part of an ideological redefinition of humanity that is right here and right now. If we do not attend to these debates and their implications, we're going to wake up one day soon to find that developments have overtaken us and that it's too late, that our bodies are really of no importance. That credit goes to Libby Edmonds, writer for Quillette online magazine, from her piece called Transhumanism Revolution, Oppression Described as Liberation. Is transhumanism really? Is it really liberation? As we finish up here, folks, I'm going to remind you, if you like what you see here and you want to support what we do, please go to armoroftruth.net. If you would. You'll find a donate tab there. I've got a new article up here that Summer has posted recently. God Never Stops Loving. Please go and check these out. You can scroll down and check out the Culture Vault, which is right here. And when you go into the Culture Vault, you'll see the fruit of Summer's labor. Here it is. She's got the Frankfurt Declaration of Christian and Civil Liberty right there. Information about the multipolar world order that we're talking about here. So much. Mixed in here, you'll see articles about what's happening in our world, and then you'll see encouraging pieces from trusted sources that Summer has compiled here. So please check out the Culture Vault at armoroftruth.net, and if you like what we do here and you want to support our work, understand that we can't do this without you. Click that donate tab and you'll find many ways There'll be some way there that will fit the way you'd like to support us. You can also check out the links in the description below this YouTube video if you're watching us on YouTube. And you can see how to support us there as well. Likewise, please subscribe to our backup YouTube channel, which is this. It is True Normal TV. This will be where you'll find us if anything crazy happens over here on armoroftruth.net on YouTube. If we need a way to reach you, we'll be here. We ask, please go over here and subscribe to True Normal TV. Help us get this channel up to 1,000 subscribers so that we can use features like the community tab so that we can be able to put out messages. You can't use that until you get to 1,000 subscribers. So help us get up to there, 1,000 subscribers on that backup channel. And if you can't find us for some reason, you don't see us for a long time on armoroftruth.net, for some reason YouTube has put us in jail or whatever, check out True Normal TV. And you can also check out, we put a lot of our clip videos end up over here on this channel. Since the beginning of history, people have used technology to overcome various challenges. And we know that things like bifocals, cars, artificial knees, smartphones, history of humanity has many instances where technology has been designed to address the many limitations that we face in our everyday lives. But is this movement really about helping the weaker? Is it really about ending suffering, or is it more about some people having more? Enhancement for what purpose? Today we have amazing technologies ranging from personal computers to improved prosthetics for the disabled. Because of these remarkable advancements, a growing number of thinkers are beginning to wonder how new technologies can help us not only overcome, but even transcend our physical limitations. These transhumanists believe that developments in science and technology will soon make possible the radical transcendence of human, biological, cognitive, and emotional limitations, and the evolution of a post-human race, even the attainment of immortality. That seems to be where they want to take it. Synthetic salvation. That is the point. We're increasingly looking at technology to solve humanity's troubles. And that's not in and of itself a bad thing. But the transhumanist movement is looking to deliver us from mortality. And because of this, we must give it a thoughtful examination. Look at its underlying assumptions, its possible consequences, and these new cybernetic technologies. French Enlightenment philosopher Nicolas de Condorcet, in his sketch for a historical picture of the progress of the human mind, expressed such confidence in humanity's capacity for unlimited progress that he wondered if, quote, the duration of the average interval between birth and wearing out would one day have no time limit whatsoever. Been thinking about this for a long time. New possibilities have arrived, not only for the alleviation of human suffering, but also the enhancement, if you want to call it that, of humanity. But we have to ask ourselves, does suffering have a purpose? Is man truly interested in alleviating suffering? Or is that just a side effect of the desire to transcend? Or the desire to be the purest? Is enhancement necessarily a good thing? The prospect of one day replacing functional human limbs with enhanced bionic prostheses. This is, I wanted to show you this. Here you go. This was a quote that I found for you. In a transhuman world, the disabled will be the ones without prosthetic limbs. Right? The disabled will be the ones without prosthetic limbs in a transhuman world. According to Ray Kurzweil, this dream of immortality will be fulfilled once humans cease to be confined to bodily limitations and opt for this post-biological existence, which will offer more than immortality. They'll gain a whole set of abilities, pleasures, and experiences that transcend those of bodily existence. So he surely makes it sound attractive if you don't have a consistent worldview. Kurzweil, with obvious zeal, says the road we're going down is a road paved with gold. It's full of benefits that we're never going to resist. Continued growth and economic prosperity, better health, more intense communication, more effective education, more engaging entertainment, better sex, he says. Right? This from the crowd who thinks that Margaret Sanger was just a good feminist. Strong female voice. Even spiritual experiences, Ray Kurzweil proclaims, will be capable of enhancement in the post-human age. As scientists discover the neurological correlates of the variety of spiritual experiences, Kurzweil is certain that these experiences too will be heightened as human beings achieve ever-increasing technological complexity. Some transhumanists are genuinely concerned about potentially negative consequences. Right? And that's good to know that at least some of them are thinking about this possibly going the wrong way. The Transhumanist Declaration, as we looked at the beginning of the show, acknowledges that humanity faces serious risks, especially from the misuse of new technologies. It's important that they say to carefully deliberate how best to reduce risks and expedite beneficial applications. Once again, who decides what's beneficial? What standard are they using? What are the ethical objections? We've tried to cover plenty of those tonight. Two strongest objections made against this vision both concern the limited availability of future technologies. Unless significant changes are made to the world's economy, which is being done now, that's what the Great Reset is like, or is what it's about, is to establish a playing field where this can occur, where transhuman technologies and capabilities can be implanted even to those who could never afford it, because after all, that's how you get control of the people. It's almost certain that a transition into a post-human existence will be expensive. A large portion of humankind simply will not have access to post-biological technologies. As a result, a small portion of super-advanced post-humans could conceivably exist alongside a larger population of normal, unenhanced persons who will be called the handicapped. In his book, Beyond Humanity, Alan Buchanan notes that despite there being no logical reason For enhanced persons to see themselves as superior to the unenhanced, they nevertheless, quote, might think themselves so superior that they would treat mere persons as if they had a lower moral status than they have. You know that's going to happen. That's obviously going to happen. Even if posthumans did resist the bigotry, they might reshape society at large in order to suit their increased ability and efficiency. Whilst such a super society might prove remarkably sophisticated, Buchanan notes that posthumans could engineer it in such a way that the unenhanced, in effect, become the disabled. They're unable to participate, or unable to participate in a minimally competent way in core economic and political processes. Since our modern society already has trouble incorporating those who are physically and cognitively disabled, one wonders what place there will be for unenhanced persons living in a society tailored to posthumans. The Transhumanist Project assumes certain givens that the Christian must address. One fatal assumption is observed by ethicist and theologian Gilbert Meilander is, quote, a thoroughgoing commitment to materialistic reductionism. That everything comes down to matter. Even for spiritually minded thinkers such as Ray Kurzweil, spirituality is tied merely to human consciousness. For the transhumanist, he notes the sum of human consciousness is finally reducible to brain activity. There's one problem with that. Emotions, feelings, even memories cannot be reduced to the brain. It's the problem of consciousness. It's the hard problem of consciousness. It's never been solved. That's because we're created in the image of God. A soul and a body combined. And they cannot be separated until God decides. Christianity has a far more positive conception of the body, rather than seeing the body as a key part of a human being. The transhumanist joins the rest of modernity in preferring the mind over matter. But the Christian has the full conception of the body. Humans were created by God as spiritual creatures endowed with both body and soul. Genesis 2. The body is accorded great dignity because Christ, in the fullness of time, became flesh and dwelt among us. It was his human body that was glorified at the transfiguration. It was in a human body that the Son of God endured suffering, died, and was raised for the salvation of humanity. It was Christ who, in his human body, ascended to the Father's right hand in glory, where he now intercedes on behalf of his creation. For centuries, faithful Christians have longed and hoped for a bodily resurrection. The body, despite its faults and limitations in this life, is integral to the Christian understanding of both personhood and salvation. For the transhumanist, however, the body is just another obstacle to overcome. The transhumanist's greatest pitfall, though, is its equivocation of freedom with autonomy. The capacity for individuals to govern themselves without limits. At the heart of transhumanism's quest for bodily transcendence lies a greater desire: the freedom to be in complete control of one's destiny. As C.S. Lewis writes, once again, in that hideous strength, quote, dreams of the far future destiny of man were dragging up from its shallow, unquiet grave the old dream of man as God, Homo Deus. Despite the many positive ends to which transhumanism strives, the improvement of quality of life, the mitigation of suffering, etc., the Christian concept of being is not narrowly defined as sheer autonomous will. Rather, as William Cavanaugh articulates, quote, all being participates in God, the source of being, unquote. For the Christian, true freedom is found in the service of worthwhile ends, ends which find their fulfillment in God alone. Our hope does not rest in a theoretical technological evolution. Once again, as C.S. Lewis notes in Mere Christianity, quote, the next step has already appeared, and it is really new. It is not a change from brainy men to brainier men. It is a change that goes off in a totally different direction. A change from being creatures of God to being sons of God. In Christ, the Word made flesh, the next step in humanity has already come. And we, as Christians, trust that He will one day come again. Just as our Lord Jesus died, was buried, and rose again in glory, we trust that we too will one day be raised body and soul. Transcendence for the Christian is more than a life of eternal consciousness. It is a visceral bodily eternity where men and women live in a glorified earth with glorified bodies. Revelation 21. Whereas transhumanism dreams of a disembodied mechanical immortality for humanity, we, Christians, trusting in the sure promises and work of our Lord Jesus Christ, look forward to a glorious heavenly city where we shall live and rejoice eternally in the presence of our God. Thank you for joining us, my friends. We hope you'll join us for our next presentation. We'll be back into Armor of Truth Live next week. Our show with our series with Dr. Tony Costa will be coming up soon, where we're going to go into Reformed theology, the doctrines of grace, the 5 points of Calvinism, if you want to call it that. We'll do that for you. We'll tell you, we'll answer all the objections. We'll take the best objections to it, and we will go through them piece by piece so that if you're curious about this, you can come away with a faithful description of these things from, not from myself, but from Dr. Tony Costa. I'll be playing the role of devil's advocate. I'll be setting him up so he can teach about these doctrines so that those of you who watch this channel can have a right understanding of that. And join us later this week, Lord willing, for our next installment of the Who is Jesus series. We're in Gospel of John, chapter 17, as Jesus prays to the Father on behalf of his disciples and by extension all of us. It's just hours before Jesus is arrested and taken and crucified. So don't miss that. This is a very, very edifying study. And we hope you'll join us for that. God bless you, my friends. We'll see you next time.
The hammer comes down and beats you over the head for the rest of your life with a big national security stick. And so that people learn to duck their head and not speak up. Because bad idea now.
Well, that's a rather interesting position coming from a man on a crusade against the evils of technology.
I'm not against technology, Doctor. I'm against the men who deify it at the expense of human truth.
Armor of Truth. Live.
In the age of technocracy, scientism, and pop atheism.
Faith is resistance.
Nietzsche, of course, announced the death of God and called for the birth of the Übermensch, the Superman, who would take humanity to new heights and to create a new world order.
Find us at the Armor of Truth YouTube channel and log on armoroftruth.net.